I want to talk to you about doing diligence. Let's say you're at the beginning of your rental development process. You're new, you haven't gone on the market yet, or you are renting, but you're hearing from the town or the city where you're operating that more attention is being given to short-term rentals, and regulations and caps are starting to become part of the process because local housing is being impacted by the number of short-term rentals in the market. In either case, you want to check what is the local code and how you need to comply with that, because you don't want to get into a situation where you're going to be fined, or heaven forbid, you're going to be stopped from operating in the middle of a short-term rental season where you already have bookings and income coming in. You need to do your diligence about making sure that you're compliant with code. There's a building code that is local to your municipality, your town, or your city, or your province, your state. Usually there are state or province-wide regulations, and then there are also local regulations that can affect what it means to have a human habitable space, a compliant accommodation that is different than it is if it were family. So that's a little bit of a sniggly thing. The regulations can be a little bit different if it's just you having your family members using a space than it is if it's a rental client who is using that space. That changes the equation because there's a perception that there's added use if there's a tenant, and that can affect things like wastewater systems. In any case, you want to be compliant with what that local code is. And that means it's building code like carpentry, it's also electrical, it's also plumbing. And then of course there's the safety component, because obviously you don't want to be somebody who's in a situation where a smoke alarm didn't go off or some horrible situation happened and somebody's life is at risk. That's not you. So you're going to be compliant. And even though it might be tempting to skip this part, it's just not worth it, because if you're out of compliance, the local regulating code enforcement officer is in a position to fine you or to stop operations if you're not compliant, if they learn that you're operating and you're not on the record. So it's just not worth it to try to circumvent that and rent anyway without being on the record, because that can come back to bite you after you're already invested, and especially if you have an income stream going that you're reliant on. So what does that mean? That means you're going to find out what is the local code. Okay, you can look that up. It's obviously on the public record. Also, if you find that to be challenging to wade through, like where do all these different pieces get woven into the code that might affect me, and how is it different for rentals, you can pop the question into ChatGPT that will give you an introduction. That's not final. You still need to go to the local code office and make sure that you understand what those regulations are, and get clarity if you don't. And then when you're doing that, you need to make sure that you're having a conversation about rentals, which, for example, in our area is about accessory dwelling units, for example. If it is a separate space on your primary property, say a detached garage with an apartment over it, or a detached building altogether, or if it's a space that's part of your primary home, say the rec room that's over the garage that's part of your house, and you want to now convert that into a rental, you want an occupancy permit, but you also want to make sure, again, that everybody's clear that you're going to be renting, so that if there is an additional registration or element that needs to be introduced, sometimes the fire department will need to come in and inspect and make sure that it's a safe space. That's free. And that may be scary, but again, it's in your best interest to do your diligence and make sure that you have a safe and appropriate property. If you find out that when you go to register, or the fact that your local municipality is requiring that you do register, and that feels scary, like what is that going to mean for me down the road with a short-term rental? Are they going to take away my source of income? I just want you to know that you do have the capacity to pivot to midterm rentals or long-term rentals. It doesn't mean that your space can't be habitable or rented or be a source of income. And that is an issue that some people are facing in highly tourist-driven regulated environments that are becoming increasingly regulated because of the loss of housing units for local residents. Think of it as like an Airbnb 3.0 kind of an impact that a lot of places are starting to regulate. And that can feel scary to owners. Like, what does that mean? If I register, am I going to get impacted in a negative way in the future? It's still better to register now and be in upfront, especially if they do cap down the road. You don't want to be somebody who's capped out. But also, you do have the capacity to pivot if you need to. And midterm rentals are a market. That is a market. And sometimes that is close to short-term rentals in terms of income. It's a lot more stable. There's a lot less turnover. There's a lot less churn. So sometimes you can net as much profit as you would if it was short-term rentals, especially if you're in an area where you have locum tenens, nurses coming in to stop gaps at the local hospital system. That's an entire industry of healthcare workers that come for short stays. Mid and long term is really anything over 30 days for midterm, 6 months for long term. And that means that you are in a different category in terms of how the local code enforcement and regulations are going to regulate you. You are less susceptible to being capped and managed in the future. Also, the taxes are different, especially when you get over 6 months in a lot of municipalities. You don't have to collect that lodging tax. And so that brings the price down for your tenant, but it doesn't necessarily have to bring your rent down. You can still earn the same, even though the barrier is lowered for your tenant to come in. So sometimes that's beneficial and certainly less of a process to manage if you're not having to collect and report those taxes. Think of it as an important element of due diligence that you're going to do up front, along with insurance, which is going to be rental specific. We'll talk about that in another video. Check the show notes for a link. And also in terms of what your legal structure is. That was the third piece of doing diligence. Also a separate video that we'll have in the show notes. And then of course, you're going to check out what your market is so that you know what your potential is as an income stream for rentals in your market. But this piece up front about making sure that you're code compliant is a necessary piece that you can't skip. You need to find out what those regulations are, and then you need to comply with them, which may include registering your rental. It may not, but you want to make sure that the governing body understands that this is a rental unit so that you're compliant and you don't have fines or shutdown risk looming on your horizon. So it's just a piece of doing diligence. The other piece I want to share with you is that if you are somebody who wants to know what the whole exposure is and what the whole spectrum is and how to get up and running quickly, we do have a program called the Jumpstart program, and you can hop over to our shop. We'll put the link in here and pick that up. And that gives you 4 weeks from 0 to up and running, from everything that you need to know in terms of doing diligence to setting up your property to listing and being a successful property owner. It's really important to know what you don't know, and then you'll be in a good position to start safely and to protect your asset in the long run. We'll see you next time.